Hello. Welcome or welcome back. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Laura. I'm a fashion educator, and my mission is to become your go to source of diverse histories of global fashion. Today, I'm sharing some loose thoughts about the false promises of a shared cultural heritage in Latin American fashion. This is part of my bi weekly series of half formed ideas and reflections in the quest to redress the fashion canon. So let's begin. Dear fashion friends, you may have seen on Instagram earlier this week that I've been enraged about Latin American fashion's ongoing colonialism. So, of course, I had to write about it today to untangle some of my ideas, calm my firing brain down, and hopefully regain my faith in that we can learn to do things differently, if not better. If you need some context, let me explain. Long story very short, the Peruvian Sustainable Fashion Association and Vogue Latin America organized a panel to discuss cultural appropriation last week. It brought together three of the most prominent voices in Latin American fashion, which included a designer, a lawyer, and the editor of the regional Vogue. I won't get into the details because others have done an excellent job already at describing the situation, and I'm linking one of my favorite videos below. What I want to highlight are the colonialist discourses that perhaps inadvertently shaped both the panel and the participants' responses to the backlash they received. Unfortunately, instead of well researched and thoughtful ideas, the event perpetuated discourses of white saviorism, indigenous ignorance, and a false promise of a quote unquote common heritage among people of all socio-racial backgrounds in Latin America. After spending more than a decade researching the history of Latin America, I've come to the conclusion that these three ideas are the pillars upon which both society and fashion, and perhaps even history, have been constructed. The false myth of indigenous ignorance was used as a justification to both occupy indigenous lands with the excuse of administering resources better and convert indigenous ways of being and knowing into Western European standards. White saviorism stems from the thought that colonizers had a mission to quote unquote civilize American Indians into their ways and convert them into their religions so that their souls could be quote unquote saved. But here's the thing. While the origins of a false idea that indigenous people are quote unquote ignorant and don't know better might lie on the Spanish invasion and colonization, they persist until today. Case in point is the commonly repeated narrative that indigenous people and artisans more broadly in Latin America need the help of white and whitewashed Western educated designers to be able to price, market, and sell their products to both local and global consumers. Or the idea that people external to these communities need to intervene to avoid cultural heritage from being lost. In case you're wondering, neither of these is necessarily true. And the false promise that we all share the same blood, well, we owe this to the myth of mestizaje, a sort of racial intermixing, that became especially prominent through the whitewashed nationalist discourses that began with Latin Americans' independence from the Spanish Empire. And yes, they also endure until today. The myth of mestizaje made sense as a political discourse in the 18th century, a time when white men and powerful mestizos, that is, men of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, were trying to establish their common grounds at a time when Iberian born Spaniards were trying to reclaim all power in the Americas. It was founded on the 18th century racial ideas that saw the increasing intermixing of Spanish and indigenous blood, never African though, as a strategy towards the widening of American populations. Needless to say, acculturation and the resulting erasure of separate, diverse indigenous cultures were intrinsic to the process of racial widening. In fashion, the myth of a shared cultural heritage has made us believe that some of the ancestral technologies, object types, and design motifs of indigenous origin and intellectual property in Latin America become too all, including most prominently whitened, whitewashed designers. That's why garments such as mochilas, ponchos, and huipiles, and motifs such as zigzagging patterns, diamond shapes, and embroidered florals feature so prominently in the Latin American fashion repertories. But somehow, they are only deemed fashionable when attached to a white designer or seen on white or otherwise Europeanized bodies that conform with your North American conceptions of beauty and fashionability. When seen on indigenous or otherwise racialized bodies, these garments and designs are seen as autochthonous, traditional, and somehow outside of fashion, whatever any of those terms mean. And I haven't even mentioned the many forms of discrimination that people who refuse to assimilate into the cultural hegemony of Spanish Latin America face on a daily basis. Sadly, this all extends beyond the infamous talk that has sparked all my rage this week. And while seeing such big backlash to the talk made me rekindle some of my faith in the possibility of change, I still believe that we are ages away from it actually taking momentum. First, because some industry players still accept vague apologies based on the good intentions of designers, or in this case, journalists, which we all know don't serve us any progress. Second, because many people in the region still disregard fashion as something frivolous rather than political. And different industry players seem totally uninterested in engaging with more critical points of view offered by fashion studies as a field of analysis. And thirdly, because when industry members finally accept their errors and try to offer reparations to the communities affected, they do so by donating something or simply mentioning their names without any real effort to truly change the industry dynamics or take actions that can actually sustain in the longer term. I can't claim to have all of the solutions because I don't. And one of my biggest frustrations is that as much as I've tried to bring my academic theorizations into practice by collaborating with brands, my proposals tend to be ignored. People are just not ready to do the hard work, it seems. And this is yet another reason why I have little faith in the industry, I must say. But as people who simply care about justice as individuals, I think we can continue to speak up and hold people behind brands, media, and institutions accountable. We can continue to discuss these topics, dream of alternative systems, and devise our collective strategies to redress fashion. Just like we do, by the way, in my Redressing Fashion Club, if you allow me the plug here. And we can actively use our purchasing power, which, for better or worse, it's an excellent political tool in the world that we live in, to actively construct a better world. I guess that's why I'm growing more and more inclined to work and talk about personal style just as much as I am about fashion history and the fashion industry. But I'll leave that subject for another day. Before I end, though, I'd like to remind you that all of the concepts and dynamics and structures and even the history that I've mentioned today are way too complex to unpack in such a short time. Not even a book would do. But I have written about them a bit more thoroughly elsewhere in case you want to learn more. I would suggest starting with my essay on Indigenous heritage in Latin American fashion, published earlier this year and linked below. As always, if you have thoughts about cultural appropriation and colonialism in and beyond Latin America, please, please, please share your ideas by leaving a comment, reaching out on social media, or replying to my email newsletter if you're subscribed. Thank you, thank you, thank you for reading, watching, and tuning in. And until next time.